How does evolution occur over time through natural selection? Is it environmental factors that change an organism and then the organism passes those changes to offspring? Consider this point mentioned in the last part of this lecture. If you dye your hair purple and then have a baby, is the baby born with purple hair? Of course not. Therefore, it's not the environment that changes populations, but rather genetics. Here we start considering what are the basic requirements for natural selection to occur. We start with the fact that individual members of a population differ from one another. After all, if you're in a room with other humans, no two of you look identical. In the wild, populations produce more individuals than resources can support. Therefore, many individuals will not survive long enough to reproduce. The main contribution to natural selection is whether or not an individual is able to reproduce. If the genes passed down give favorable traits for survival, then the genes will continue to be passed down. Therefore, over time, a population changes so that these genes favorable for survival and therefore traits favorable for survival will be more prevalent in the population. An adaptation is a characteristic that helps an individual survive and reproduce. Organisms have to be adapted to survive in the presence of physical environmental factors such as the climate and other living organisms. For instance, there are predators that may want to eat the organism, and the organism also has to be able to capture prey so it can eat to survive. Specific examples of adaptations include a cactus is able to soak up large amounts of water during a rainfall to save it to use it during times of drought in the desert. Another example is the white winter coat of the Arctic fox gives it camouflage so it blends into its surrounding environments and also warmth against the cold temperatures. All organisms are products of evolution adapted to their environment. This species of cactus can soak up to 750 liters of water in a single rainstorm, enabling it to survive the dry conditions of the desert in Mexico and the southwestern United States. The white winter coat of the Arctic fox is an adaptation to its environment, providing camouflage and warmth. We've already mentioned that members within a population differ slightly from one another. We can take this one step further and state that members of each generation differ slightly from members of the previous generation. For instance, you don't look identical to your parents. These small changes accumulate over time, producing major transformations to select for phenotypes that allow survival. Phenotypes that do not allow for survival in a particular environment will disappear from a population. For instance, if a lion is born that runs super slow, it will not be able to catch prey to eat, and therefore it will not survive, and this slow phenotype will not survive in the population. Remember that the environment doesn't cause evolution to occur, but rather a random mutation in DNA that gives a trait that allows an organism to survive in a particular environment that starts the evolution process. For instance, in the last lecture, we discussed Darwin's finches and beak size. If a random mutation gives a finch a beak size that allows it to better utilize a food source on a particular island, it will be able to eat, therefore it will be able to survive, and therefore it will be able to reproduce. However, sometimes the right allele is simply not available in an organism to mutate to allow survival, and an environmental change could lead to extinction. For instance, what if Arctic temperatures heat up and animals adapted for cold like polar bears are not able to mutate to lose their fat layer known as blubber and their thick coat? Here, a field biologist tranquilizes a polar bear for study. There's much concern over rising temperatures in the Arctic and how this will affect survival of organisms living there. Natural selection is sometimes called survival of the fittest. So just what does fittest mean in evolutionary terms? Well, in evolutionary terms, fitness refers to an organism's reproductive contribution to the next generation, which forms the basis of natural selection. This doesn't always equate to strength or speed or even survival past a certain age. For example, the male praying mantis insect seen below dies during the reproductive process, but from an evolutionary standpoint, it is still considered fit if it passes on its genes before it dies. If reproduction forms the basis of natural selection, then any traits that help an animal to acquire a mate so they can reproduce will help the process. This is known as sexual selection, which is selection that acts on traits that help an animal acquire a mate. An example is feathers in male peacocks, which are attractive to female peacocks. This beautiful feather display of the male peacock helps it to attract a mate so it can pass down its genes. While natural selection is responsible for adaptations that promote survival and reproduction, it is not the only mechanism of evolution. There are 4 more ways a population can evolve as follows: mutation, genetic drift, nonrandom mating, and migration, all of which are discussed on the upcoming slides. Recall that a mutation is a change in a DNA sequence. This may occur during cell division or from environmental factors. On average, every time a human cell divides, 3 mistakes are made. A mutation in a germ cell that gives rise to gametes may be passed to offspring to enter a population gene pool. A mutant human gene appears in about 1 in 100,000 gametes, and therefore in about 1 in 50,000 newborns, since a newborn results from the fusion of 2 gametes. A mutation doesn't occur in response to environmental necessities, rather it occurs by chance. Therefore, whether a mutation is helpful, harmful, or neutral depends on the environment into which an organism is born. Another mechanism of evolutionary change is genetic drift, in which allele frequencies in populations are changed by chance events besides mutations that prevent reproduction. Examples include seeds may fall into a pond and never sprout, natural disasters may kill organisms, or animals with recessive alleles don't breed, so the recessive alleles are not passed down. Genetic drift has a greater effect on small populations, as fewer individuals will have particular alleles. Genetic drift in a population can lead to the elimination of an allele from a population by chance. In this example, rabbits with the brown coat color allele, uppercase B, are dominant over rabbits with the white coat color allele, lowercase b. In the first generation, the 2 alleles occur with equal frequency. Only half of the individuals reproduce, resulting in a second generation with less recessive alleles. In the second generation, only 2 homozygous dominant individuals reproduce, so that the recessive B allele is lost in the third generation altogether. The founder effect is a form of genetic drift in which a small group of individuals separates from its initial population to establish an isolated group. This leads to certain alleles becoming prevalent while others become rare in this new group. An example would be insects with specific alleles colonize a new island, and the rest of the alleles from the original population disappear. Red insects migrate to an island and start breeding. The yellow allele and trait disappears from this new population on the island. The bottleneck effect is also a form of genetic drift, which leads to a permanent loss of genetic diversity that results from a population shrinking in size rapidly. An example is that only a few thousand cheetahs remain in the wild, all with similar genetics, so that an environmental change could kill them all. A chance event or catastrophe can reduce the genetic variability within a population. The cheetah population experienced a genetic bottleneck such that only a few thousand cheetahs remain in the wild. We've already discussed mutations in different types of genetic drift that can cause evolution to occur. Here we discuss non-random mating. Some populations do mate randomly. For instance, wind may blow pollen from one plant to another. In this case, the plants are not choosing who they produce offspring with. Most animals, however, do show a preference for a mate, therefore individuals with the most desirable traits leave the most offspring. Examples include strength in male lions and feathers in male peacocks that we discussed earlier as an example of sexual selection. This beautiful feather display of the male peacock helps it to attract a mate, which is an example of non-random mating. Another driving force behind evolution is migration, in which individuals move into or out of a population. This brings new alleles into a population or takes alleles out of a population. For instance, in the human population, alleles are mixing from different areas of the world due to migration as humans move from one country to another. A brown insect migrates from one geographic location to another to add new alleles to the green insect population.